Nigeria's dependence on cash has been brought to the forefront over the past few weeks. Africa's largest economy has a very big informal sector, which is made up of jobs like farming, street and market trade, and public transportation that aren't fully regulated by the government or the law. The truth is that cash remains king in Nigeria, with the country being one of the top 3 unbanked countries in the world. According to the World Bank, only 45% of adults in Nigeria have accounts with regulated financial institutions. Out of the over 45 million unbanked adults, 73% do not have the requisite documents to open a Tier 3 bank account. This has led to the growth of point-of-sale terminals as a quick way for people across the country to get money. But the resulting scarcity of the naira due to the Central Bank of Nigeria's naira redesign policy has led to widespread protests, property damage, and supply chain disruption. This has also made it crystal clear that Nigerians need a variety of options to access their money and pay for goods and services, such as paying to use Nigeria's transport system. Since most Nigerians work in the informal sector, digitizing payments in these sectors would be the best way to go. Joining me now is Olumide Afolabi. He's the CEO and co-founder of Touch and Pay Technologies, also known as TAP, which is a Nigerian fintech company and a leading processor of microtransactions here on the continent. Olumide, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the micropayment space before we narrow down into the situation happening here in Nigeria. So the work that TAP mainly does is in that micropayment space. And a lot of people will just say a payment is a payment. They don't know the difference between whether it's a big payment or a micropayment. So Olumide, starting from there, with Nigeria's very large informal sector, why do we need to pay attention to this micropayment space that you operate in?
Yeah, before you pay for, let's say, tuition fee or buy a house, a lot of people, millions of people have, done one form of microtransaction or the other, either paying for bus ride or, buying gala on the road and all that. So micropayments is still the very heart of the African economy, not just in Nigeria. And so transactions between 10 cents to $10, these are categorized under microtransactions. And millions of people still depend on this transaction to go by every day, even people that have bank accounts. So this is why we needed to pay attention to it.
Okay, so as part of digitizing Africa, we've seen it's not just Nigeria that's on a cashless policy drive. A lot of the continent is. We've seen the success in Kenya with M-Pesa and, of course, the electronic money transfers. When we look at it in terms of micropayments being a part of the solution to Africa's financial market becoming digitized, how do they make up an aspect of that solution?
Okay, so we believe that millions of people, because they still depend on microtransactions today, digitizing it is not a question. It's something that both the central bank, the regular banks needs to think about. And the reason is because Africa is still really poor, because a lot of SMEs or MSMEs rather still depend on microtransactions to go by. And if you can't see their transaction because they still largely rely on cash, you cannot really help them. You will be asking for collateral to borrow them money or to do any stuff like that with the bank. So if we're able to digitize these payments and people are able to see the transaction, we can rely on a booming small and medium enterprises to improve the economy of Africa. This is why it is very important that we have a common effort to figure out a way to digitize and process microtransactions so that there can be visibility, there can be accountability, and there can be money pumping to where money should be pumping to. Things like improving transportation. Look at Lagos, for example, we have a lot of downfalls and a lot of them are rickety. And you'll be surprised that some of them make up to 100,000 naira a day in Nigeria. That's about $70 or thereabouts. And if people are able to see this transaction, they are able to change their buses and we will improve the quality of life on the road.
It's interesting you mentioned Lagos because we're coming to Nigeria as of now. So Nigeria has been on this cashless policy drive for about a decade now. I remember when it was announced by the CBN in January 2012, there it was. And it had a lot of issues. We had the pilot schemes in Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt before it expanded to the rest of the country. But many would have expected that 10 years down the line, we'd be further along when it comes to the infrastructure that supports the cashless payments or that supports online transactions. But what we've seen in the past few weeks is that with the pressure that has come onto that infrastructure because of the CBN's redesign policy, it seems that the cashless policy has seemingly failed a litmus test. It's failed a pressure test that additional millions of Nigerians have put on it. So has it failed, or it's just simply a part of the growing pains of this kind of policy direction?
Yeah, so when we talk about scalability, a lot of us take it for granted. Because I had a technical background before becoming the CEO, I understand that the infrastructure to hold 10,000 transactions a day is not the same to hold a million transactions or a billion transactions a day. And you'll be surprised that a lot of the banks today are not really ready for that kind of infrastructure. Coupled with the fact that a lot of people are, we have this term that we use in Nigeria, japa. So most of the technical people that are able to, come together and build this infrastructure, they've left the country because they felt that, this country is not doing them any good and all that. So we had a lot of brain drain, people we lost to the UK, US, looking for, due to globalization, looking for white-collar job and all that. So it becomes very difficult to really maintain the infrastructure and scale what we currently have. So when the CBN came, the policy meant a Nigerian banking system that is not ready. And that's why we have this failure. And I mean, a lot of people have started taking advantage of it. We have startup fintechs coming up right now to take advantage of it. I mean, you could see money point POS everywhere. I used to tell my partner that Touch and Pay probably process more transactions than most banks today because we help over 400,000 people pay for bus rides every day. And this transaction must work. It must go through. So that kind of infrastructure is what Nigerians should push for, where we can have 1 million, 10 million, 1 billion people, using an infrastructure, and that infrastructure is anti-fragile, is not going to collapse. So that's the major challenge. So I can say that it collapsed because the banking infrastructure that Nigeria currently have is not ready for the cashless policy.
Let me follow up with that, because I think there's a bit of a difference between how it happened with the traditional financial banking institutions and some of these fintechs in the space you play, because I've done a number of transactions in the recent weeks. What I found is that with my traditional banking institution, I had serious issues. But with the fintechs who've come into this space, the payments were going, rarely reversed, rarely taking time. What lesson is there for the traditional financial institutions when you see how successful many of the fintechs have been in this particular challenging time that Nigerians have faced?
Okay, so as fintechs that is funded, we can play the globalization game. So what I mean by that is that, look at Money Point, for example, Team Apps. They raised $50 million. They can afford to pay a developer $10,000 a month, for example, or $5,000 a month to build a scalable system. But a typical Nigerian bank feels that it's absurd to invest that kind of money into tech. Although some of them have started waking up, but it's just a tad too late for them to do. So I think that's the major challenge. So fintechs they can have a hub in the US or UK, housing world-class developers, building infrastructure to support the financial system, whereas a traditional bank in Nigeria is just waking up to the call, just start seeing the opportunities and the feasibility. And that's why we feel that fintech is going to win in this market. So the major challenge, or the major reason why we see that at play, is because the infrastructure that the commercial bank have put in place to support transactions is not as solid, or is not even able to compete with the kind of infrastructure that fintechs in Nigeria have. Look at Florida, look at Paystack. They have global backing. Paystack is now acquired by Stripe, which is like the #1 leading payment processor in the world. So it's like comparing lion with a goat, really.
I think I might want to take that I'll leave that alone, Olamide. All right, so we've talked about the infrastructure. We've talked about the difference between the traditional financial institutions and what the fintechs are doing. But I want to just stay on this a little bit because as the past few weeks have unfolded, we've also seen that there are obviously things we need to take note of when it comes to Nigeria's cashless policy drive. In terms of how you've seen things develop in the past few weeks, and particularly in this micropayment space you work in, what are the few things that you think Nigeria's regulators and policymakers should take note of, sort of like the lessons learned, so that in the next 1 month, 3 months, we're not back to where we were 2 weeks ago? There's actually a building upon some of the issues and challenges that have been raised in the past few weeks.
So honestly, I'll go a bit broad on this. And we keep saying this. America was built by entrepreneurs. Even the West in general, UK, everywhere, they are developed by entrepreneurs. We see people, we see governments collaborating with the likes of JP Morgan, to finance stuff. So it's the same thing that should happen in Nigeria, in Africa generally, if we really want to grow. We need to empower private sector people. We need to empower people that, they are not going to see this thing like their life do not depend on it, or they are not entitled people. So if you go to a typical government state now, you see a lot of entitlement and all that. So when financial sector, traditional banks start working with fintech, start collaborating the right way, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a win-win situation where we can then have a real cashless policy push in Africa. We can see a lot of people actually, being able to have a smooth transaction. The bank warehousing the money as it should be, instead of the bank now trying to become a fintech, which they have no, they don't have any infrastructure towards, they also do not have the learnings towards. But we have people that have been doing fintech all their life. The bank should support them more, push further to just warehouse money, be a bank, borrow people money, rely on the infrastructure that fintechs are pushing, and let us have a very interesting economy with a good cashless policy that can work. So I feel that the only way this can really work is the policymakers working with the private sector and working with the traditional bank as well to ensure that all this works. Muslim Bank in the UK, Brex in the US, these are businesses that are over $1 billion valuation, and they are working. People prefer them to traditional banks, and they don't have regulations strangling on their neck because they wanted the regulations to favor only the traditional banks. And if we don't stop doing that as a country, we are not going to go anywhere.
Okay, I'll come back to that as part of my final question. But before we move further, Olumide, you work in the micropayment systems, and you talked about doing some 400 transactions for people who use public transport in Lagos on a daily average. And that seems to be at the very lowest level. But those often sometimes can be people who are unbanked, who don't have the requisite documents, as I mentioned earlier, to have a tier 3 bank account. And when you look at that, it also keeps them out of the financial system. So you may be making it easy for them to make some payments and do certain things, but it doesn't give them the wide range of options that they should have if they were fully part of the financial payment system. So it's obvious that Nigerians need more options for financial inclusion. So what should those options really look like?
Yeah, so people can only be financially included at the point of their need. You cannot treat financial inclusion like evangelism, where the Jehovah's Witness person is coming to knock on your door and say, you have to be born again. You will have to wait for people where they needed to perform financial transactions and financially include them there. And if you look at our strategy in town, with the product we built, Cowrie, that people are using for payments in Nigeria, in Lagos today, you see that we partnered with Lagos State to build an ecosystem where people can actually get financial instruments to pay for transportation. We've collected enough information to open a tier 1 account for those kind of people. And whether you like it or not, we have actually kind of financially included those people. So in doing this thing, we have millions and millions, we have over 3 million customers, by the way, that have now been financially included. In a way, the account they have is probably a tier 1 account, not tier 2 or tier 3, but it can be upgraded. So this is the way to really go about the financial inclusion that we all talk about. I feel that we've been so theoretical about it, and we've not been practical about it. We have a lot of POS agents around just doing cash out, doing cash distribution. So, and at the end of the day, we see now that has failed our true picture. It is not transparent that we have nothing. We only have a distribution channel for cash. We've not truly really have a cashless economy like we claim to have. So we really need to take a back step and rethink this whole thing and start empowering people that are really doing the hard work of truly digitizing payments. And we need to do advocacy. We need to do a lot of work to ensure that we are really doing financial inclusion. And I think the closest countries to this is probably Kenya, because M-Pesa, people actually transfer through M-Pesa. But in Nigeria, what we call financial inclusion is just cash in, cash out, honestly. And I mean, it is now obvious now that we have nothing.
Do you think we need to change our definition of financial inclusion? Because as you're speaking, given the work TAP is doing, you're saying you're able to bring people into at least tier 1 bank accounts. That at least has some level of documentation, name, has to be attached possibly with a BVN, am I correct? So they're in some way coming into the system. Is it about us really changing what financial inclusion truly looks like rather than trying to hold on to a standard that may be very, very difficult for millions of Nigerians and even Africans to meet?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you because somebody told me that the word credit is a Latin word that means believe, like you trust the system. So if we don't start thinking about payments in that sense, where there needs to be a higher trust index to payments before we start pushing technology to people, I think we're going to fail. So we really need to localize the definition of financial inclusion to our own reality. And except we do that, I don't think we're going to go anywhere.
All right, so Olumide, before I let you go, I'm coming back to this Harmonious Cashless Policy drive. It's a decade for Nigeria, but obviously has failed a very significant test in the past few weeks. How do we harmonize it? How do we bring millions of Nigerians into the financial systems? How do we push for more cashless payments, which would also, of course, help the government and what they've said against anti-money laundering, financing of terrorism, bringing in more people, knowing who is who and who has what, really, also in terms of protecting Nigeria's economy. How do we harmonize Nigeria's cashless policy drive?
It's very simple, and let me be a bit practical here. If you take all the stakeholders in the transport sector together and you tell them that, hey, we need to make sure that the only means of payment is this digital front, and people don't have a choice if they need to move from one point to another, and then we pick a very simple digital payment system for them to use, and we do that and we are successful. And we go to the markets. We go to all the public markets in Nigeria where people spend cash today, and we call all the this is the only means of payment.
Olumide, go ahead.
And we're able to, work with all the stakeholders that really rely on cash for their transactions to be done. I think that will be the starting point of having an harmonized cashless policy, because we know where this cash are spent. We know where they are going. We know where a lot of us have to withdraw cash after talking about cashless policy and spend them. We know how we have to transfer money to our drivers to go and withdraw cash from POS so that they can buy fuel. If we're able to take all these stakeholders and figure out a way to make it easy for them to accept cashless policies, I'm very sure that we start getting somewhere. But if we don't do that, it's just going to be a theory and it's never going to be practical.
It will remain a policy on paper, but never become an actual part of our lives. Olumide Afolabi, CEO of Touch and Play Technologies, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge.
Thanks a lot for having me, Tolulope.
All right.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
You too.